Thank you so much for having me. It's a joy to be back in Canada again. I have spent some of my youth here. I spent 2 years at high school in Ontario, and then I was at Cégep in Quebec, and then after that, Western University. And I look back on my time spent here with joy, and I've seen much change in Canada in the years since. But I'm actually here to talk about the tariffs, and I should probably do a disclaimer at the beginning. I'm not a huge fan. I come from a free trade, free market background, previously worked for the United Kingdom's Department for International Trade, and I also work for the US government as well. I have a late British father and an American mother, and I literally embody the transatlantic relationship. Basically, when you're looking at tariffs, I was expecting Trump 1 again. Trump 2 has been vastly different. In President Trump's first term, he had different staff. He very much relied upon the sort of establishment Republican people in Washington. He was very much guided in his trade policy by Ambassador Robert Lighthizer, who's a trade lawyer who's worked for successive Republican presidential administrations going back to the 1980s, and I believe even the 70s. In that process, Ambassador Lighthizer, who's a lawyer, guided him through President Trump, the legal tariff authorities open to him. And I'm primarily referring to the 301, the 201, and the 232 tariffs. Now, I'm not going to go on about this too much because I don't want to bore you and put you to sleep. But if you look at a 301, that's a tariff about unfair practices. So, for example, Uyghur forced labor in China would be an unfair trade practice, not to mention a horrible humanitarian crisis and horrible practice. But that's a 301 tariff. Now that takes about 8 to 9 months to get out the door and implement into law. So, for example, you have to produce you have to do an investigation. You must produce an investigation report. You must have consultation with stakeholders, Congress, etc. And so there's a process. And I think President Trump found that lengthy process to get out a singular tariff about, say, something like steel or aluminium. He found that rather restricting. And so this time around, he's relied upon different staff. So, for example, Peter Navarro was one of the first people to enter the administration. It's a non-statutory role. He didn't have to go through Senate confirmation. And he has advised the president to aggressively use emergency legislation to impose tariffs, which is not what happened in President Trump's first term. Also, I think that there's an unnecessary emphasis in this administration on the trade deficit. I'm less concerned about a trade deficit for the following reason. A trade deficit for the United States is simply a flip side of a demand for our assets. We make financial assets in the United States, which the whole world wants to invest in. So in other words, we have an investment surplus. We also, Americans, proportionally speaking, have larger purchasing power in which to purchase things around the world, so they have greater purchasing power. God help us if we lose that, because one way to address a trade deficit is to make us poorer and make the United States not a place for foreign investment. So I'm less concerned about the trade deficit. Now, on Liberation Day, they called these tariffs reciprocal, but they weren't. They were basically calculating in April, when they declared those tariffs, they were calculating our trade deficit with countries, but not including services. And so, for example, on the Heritage Foundation's Economic Freedom Index, Singapore rates #1, Switzerland rates as #2 as the most economically free country in the world. They got 39% tariffs because of a trade deficit. So I'm not quite convinced about the methodology. Also, since the tariffs have been implemented, we've actually had some bad news. Since the tariffs have earlier this year were announced, the US has lost over 50,000 manufacturing jobs. That's very serious. 5 plants have been closed in Michigan. Cleveland Cliffs has idled a blast furnace to make steel in Michigan. Our soybean farmers, I had a soybean farmer association come to me and say, would the Heritage Foundation endorse a bailout for the soybean farmers, because they're now selling their soybeans at below production cost. Why? Because China's now purchasing soybeans from Brazil as an alternative, as well as the soybean industry in the United States is suffering from retaliatory tariffs. So that's unfortunate. So we've had some bad economic news, and that's whilst most of the tariffs have been in abeyance. If you look at a recent report by the Institute of Supply Management, manufacturing in the United States over the past several months has contracted. So again, and if you look at the historic examples of this, there's really no good example. The McKinley tariffs of 1890 led to a depression in 1893. And the Harding tariffs of the 1920s led to a recession. And the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, which was meant to end the Great Depression, it actually prolonged it. And that was a 20% tariff on every country and every product coming to the United States around the world. Sadly, after 95 years, perhaps we have to make this mistake again because people have short-term memories. I believe that the markets will be a moderating force. For example, in April, we got the first 3-month stay on the majority of the tariffs, Liberation Day tariffs, because Scott Bessent went to the president and said, the Treasury Secretary, and said, the bond market's about to crash. And so they pulled back. President Trump literally had his own Liz Truss moment. So the markets can be a moderating force on this. Also, we have midterm elections coming up next year. A lot of members of Congress and senators, when I speak to them and their staff, I say, why aren't you challenging this? You're producing all this, these apples in the state of Washington. We couldn't possibly consume them all here in the United States. We produce more apples just in the state of Washington, let alone Oregon, New England, New York State, that we could possibly consume ourselves. We must export. We must be an exporting nation. And they say, well, we're going to wait and let the courts solve this because we, of course, have to go through the primaries. We don't want President Trump to put up some candidate against us. And the Congress who just told me that the other day has been in Congress about 25 years. But that's a real concern. But after the primaries, it may be too late for some of them. And the Republicans may lose the House of Representatives in Congress as a result. So, again, I'd like to also talk about manufacturing. And President Trump did get elected on a platform of making manufacturing great again. And I would like to make manufacturing in the United States great again. But I don't believe that tariffs are the answer. For example, in 1990, the United States had 57 blast furnaces in which to make steel. We're now down to 11 operable blast furnaces. One in Birmingham, Alabama, in February, the door blew open and molten steel flew out and the people working there were permanently disfigured and injured. That blast furnace in Birmingham, Alabama was built in 1890. It got its last upgrade in 1950. We have some very, very old infrastructure. And tariffs aren't going to solve this problem, but deregulation will. So, for example, it takes so long to go through the regulations, the zoning, all the red tape to build a blast furnace, you might as well import your steel from Canada. And we do. We get 40% of our refined steel from Canada. And here, and even just last year, the Biden-Harris administration imposed new regulations on the emissions from steel. And let's face it, steel production and net zero targets, as I call them, net zero targets and steel production don't mix. But we're getting this steel from Canada because you're using nuclear power in Ontario and hydroelectric power in Quebec to produce the steel and aluminium. It takes about 10 years in the United States, due to regulation, to build a nuclear reactor. So again, the tariffs aren't the answer, but deregulation is. I'll also give you an example from agriculture. In the United States, some of our sheep farmers are losing up to 40% of their herds to coyotes and foxes, okay, predators. In Australia and New Zealand, in Australia, for example, they can strategically place, their farmers can place poison bait around their farms to deal with predators. And New Zealand's blessed without any predators. But you'll have people in Washington from the protectionist side say, let's just tariff Australian and New Zealand lamb and that's the solution. My response to that is no. We've created this problem here in Washington. We've had an animal rights lobby that prioritizes coyotes and foxes over sheep. We have a radical environmentalist lobby that believes that sheep and cows emit gases through belching and other means and damage the ozone layer, etc. So they actually see sheep and cows is not a good part of the ecosystem. This extremism has led to us basically not permitting our farmers to strategically placing poison bait. And civil servants at the Environmental Protection Agency came up with non-solutions. They told our farmers to invest in these very expensive collars and poison patches on the collar and said, just put this on your sheep and the coyote will bite into that and it will die and then the sheep will be fine. What happens is the coyote is not stupid, it just bites around it and you're left with a dead sheep carcass and an expensive poison patch and collar that didn't work. So again, we created a lot of problems in Washington and we can fix them there without tariffs. We can actually get better regulations and deregulate. With regards to the lawsuits, Republicans, conservatives, small businesses that cannot afford the tariffs and cannot afford to absorb them like the big corporations. They can't afford to front-run the tariffs, meaning purchase large volume of stock and put it in warehouses in advance of the tariffs. They're the ones who are being most adversely affected, and they've been writing en masse to the administration about this, and they've been suing the administration. And already the administration has lost in 3 courts. We had the U.S. Court of International Trade, a judge appointed by President Obama, a judge appointed by President Reagan, and a judge appointed by President Trump in his first term. And the Trump judge was someone who was pro-tariff and protectionist. They all ruled unanimously against the administration because they say it's illegal to use emergency legislation, IEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, to implement tariffs. As I've said, the president has legal tariff authority, the ones I've mentioned, but there's a process to go through, and by using emergency legislation, they want to circumvent that process. Also, by using emergency legislation, they're doing these across-the-board tariffs, which are illegal. No president has that authority. Congress never intended that the president would use this legislation in 1977 when they passed it. It would be used for the purposes of implementing tariffs. The word tariff does not appear in the legislation. And also you have to justify a legitimate emergency under IEPA. Now, at the U.S.-Mexican border, there's obviously there's an emergency with regards to an illegal fentanyl and migration crisis. Not so on the U.S.-Canadian border. Also, they say that the trade deficits are an emergency. We've been running trade deficits for decades, and I've already explained how they're not an emergency. So again, this will eventually be decided by the courts. Another court decided on the just a few weeks ago at the U.S. Court of Appeal for the Federal Circuit against the administration, and now it's going to go to the Supreme Court, and I'm cautiously optimistic that they're going to rule that the use of IEPA is illegal. And of course, then the president can go back to using the legal tariff authorities open to him that he used in his first term, but again, those will be targeted tariffs on specific things like steel or aluminum, and no across-the-board tariff. But I'll finish on a positive note. I am a betting man, and I made a bet with a diplomat at the New Zealand embassy, and I bet him a case of champagne that the courts would shut these Liberation Day tariffs down. And he called me up sheepishly after the last court decision and said, would I accept a case of New Zealand sparkling wine instead? To which I said, absolutely. So I look forward to receiving my case of New Zealand sparkling wine, and I believe that the courts are eventually going to save the Trump administration from itself on this particular issue, because there are lots of good things the Trump administration is doing. I mean, I fundamentally and passionately believe that we have to control our borders and not have millions of people flooding into the country illegally. One of many good things that the administration's doing, also the war they've declared on ESG and DEI, which are poisons that destroy our culture and our institutions and our very civilizations. So they're doing lots of good work, and I'm very confident they will continue. Thank you so much.